Everyone he loved was gone in less than an hour. A boy stood frozen in the wreckage of his own home, watching the lower half of his mother trapped beneath a fallen beam, and behind her, closing the distance with slow, deliberate steps, something that should not exist in any sane world. It was 15 meters tall. Its skin had no muscle definition. Its mouth was fixed in something between a smile and a hunger that never ends, and its eyes carried no malice at all, no hatred, nothing a person could even argue with, just a blank, empty patience that was somehow worse than rage would have been. The boy screamed for someone, anyone, to save her. No one could. He watched it lift her into its jaws, like a man biting into bread, and something inside that boy did not just break. It rearranged itself into a single, permanent purpose. He would see every one of these creatures wiped from the earth, even if it took his entire life and everyone else's to do it. His name was Eren Yeager, and on that day, the wall that had protected humanity for 100 years came down, and so did the illusion that anyone was ever truly safe. To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand the world Eren was born into. A century before his birth, humanity had already lost. Titans, massive humanoid creatures with no apparent reproductive system, no clear intelligence, and one single, horrifying drive to consume human beings, had hunted mankind to the edge of extinction, not for nutrition. Titans gained nothing from eating people. They did it anyway, the way a wildfire needs no reason to burn. The last remnants of humanity retreated behind 3 concentric walls, named Maria, Rose, and Sina, each one nested inside the other like a set of desperate insurance policies. Inside the innermost wall, life could almost resemble peace. Inside the outer ring, life meant living every day in the shadow of 50-meter stone, trusting that the only thing between you and annihilation had held for 100 years and would hold for one more. Eren grew up in Shiganshina, a town built into Wall Maria itself, the outermost and most exposed settlement humanity had. He grew up alongside Mikasa Ackerman, a girl he had personally rescued from human traffickers after they murdered her parents, an act of violence that shaped her into someone who would spend the rest of her life terrified of losing him and quietly reorganizing her entire existence around protecting him. And he grew up alongside Armin, a frail, bookish boy who carried in his head a forbidden fascination. Books about the ocean, about a world outside the walls, a world the government insisted did not exist, or existed only as death. The 3 of them were children who wanted to see beyond their cage, in a society that had built an entire culture around telling its children not to want that. Then Wall Maria fell, not through some battle humanity lost. It fell because a titan unlike any other, 60 meters tall, encased in hardened, armor-like skin, walked up to the gate and simply broke it. Thousands of titans poured through the breach into Shiganshina. Eren's mother died in the chaos. Eren, Mikasa, and Armin survived, evacuated inland to the district behind Wall Rose, along with hundreds of thousands of refugees the interior kingdom did not want and barely had resources to feed. The government's response to an overflow of starving, homeless survivors was to draft most of them into a suicidal expedition meant to reclaim Wall Maria, a mission that killed the vast majority of participants and quietly solved the interior's food shortage by removing the mouths it did not want to feed. That single day did 2 things simultaneously. It proved that the walls, humanity's one guarantee of safety, were not guaranteed at all. And it created a 15-year-old boy who joined the military with the singular, unshakable intention of killing every Titan on Earth, alongside a girl who joined for one reason only, to make sure that boy did not die trying. Military service in this world was split into 3 branches. The garrison defended the walls themselves, patching breaches and holding the line. The military police, stationed safely in the interior, handled order and, more often, corruption and self-interest, since they were shielded from ever facing a Titan directly. And the Survey Corps, the branch almost nobody chose voluntarily, rode outside the walls into open Titan territory to map the world, gather intelligence, and die in numbers so catastrophic that joining was treated culturally as a kind of slow suicide. Eren wanted the Survey Corps from the beginning. It was the only branch that let him fight the thing that had taken his mother, instead of hiding from it. Training was not just Eren, Mikasa, and Armin. It was a whole generation of teenagers thrown together under brutal conditions, forced to decide, individually, whether they had the stomach to face what waited outside the walls. Jean Kirstein started out wanting nothing more than a safe post in the interior, openly resentful of Eren's obsession with dying gloriously for a cause, and would spend years slowly, reluctantly, becoming exactly the kind of leader he once mocked Eren for wanting to be. Connie Springer and Sasha Blaus brought a strange, necessary lightness to a group that could easily have collapsed under its own dread, Sasha's compulsive hunger for food becoming a running joke that made her death, when it eventually came, hit even harder. And Krista Lentz, a quiet girl who seemed too gentle for military life, was hiding an identity so dangerous that revealing it would eventually reshape the entire kingdom, since Krista Lentz was not her real name at all, and the truth of who she actually was had been buried by her own family to keep her from becoming a target. 3 years of brutal training later, the graduating class of 104 faced its first true test far sooner than anyone expected. The colossal Titan, the one that broke Wall Maria, appeared again, this time at Trost District, and broke through a second time. What followed was the Battle of Trost, a chaotic, desperate defense in which recruits barely out of training were thrown against Titans with real blades and no real preparation. Eren, trying to save his squad, was swallowed alive by a Titan in front of his surviving friends. It should have ended there. It did not. Eren burst back out of the creature's body, not as a corpse but transformed, standing inside the flesh of a Titan of his own, fully conscious, retaining his human mind. Eren Yeager could become a Titan. He always had the ability, buried in his blood, inherited from his father, and had simply never needed to use it until the moment his own death demanded it. Using this power, still barely understood even by Eren himself, he plugged the hole in Wall Trost with a boulder at the cost of nearly being executed by his own government for being an uncontrolled monster in human shape. Eren's transformation, and the plan to use his Titan form to lift a boulder large enough to seal the wall, very nearly failed entirely when his own comrades, unable to trust that the creature in front of them was still Eren at all, hesitated to protect him. Forcing Mikasa to stand alone in front of a half-conscious Titan she refused to believe was anything other than the boy she loved, daring anyone to prove her wrong. Afterward, Eren stood trial in front of the very government he had just saved, a public hearing where military factions argued openly, in front of him, about whether the safest course of action was to execute him on the spot before his power could be turned against humanity itself. He survived only because the Survey Corps' commander, a small, unassuming, terrifyingly effective soldier named Levi, made the argument that a weapon this valuable was worth the risk of keeping alive under close watch. An argument he punctuated by beating Eren half unconscious in front of the entire court, not out of cruelty, but to prove, visibly, that Eren could be controlled if control ever became necessary. Levi himself came from the criminal underground beneath the capital, raised by a man named Kenny who taught him to survive through violence long before he ever wore a military uniform, and that history would matter more than anyone realized for years to come. Levi and Mikasa shared something neither of them fully understood yet, a bloodline called Ackerman, scattered survivors of an ancient people whose bodies could awaken abilities beyond any ordinary soldier's reach in moments of extreme danger. A genetic echo of a war fought and lost so long ago that even the people carrying that blood had no idea what they truly were. That decision placed Eren inside the Survey Corps under Levi's direct command, and inside a series of expeditions beyond the walls that revealed the true engineered nature of the Titan threat. During one such expedition, aimed at capturing a Titan alive for research, the female Titan appeared, intelligent, fast, capable of the same conscious control Eren had, and it hunted Eren specifically, killing dozens of soldiers who tried to stop it from reaching him, including members of Levi's own elite squad. Soldiers Eren had grown close to over months of training, cut down in seconds by something wearing a human shape. When the female Titan was finally cornered inside Stohess district and its flesh stripped away, the person inside was Annie Leonhardt, a fellow cadet who had trained beside Eren and his friends for 3 years, someone they had eaten meals with, sparred with, trusted. She was not simply an enemy. She had infiltrated humanity's own military as a child, under orders, carrying a mission she may not have fully agreed with even as she carried it out. Cornered and unwilling to be captured, she encased herself in a crystal shell rather than answer for what she had done, leaving Eren and his friends with a truth that would only grow more devastating over time. The Titans that had been hunting humanity for 100 years were not simply monsters. Some of them were people. That truth cracked wide open the deeper the story went. During a later expedition known as the Clash of the Titans, the armored and colossal Titans revealed themselves openly, ambushing the Survey Corps in the open field and slaughtering soldiers by the dozens. An assault so overwhelming that Commander Erwin Smith, the man who had built and led the Corps through years of near-suicidal missions, lost his own arm trying to save what remained of his men. Inside the basement of Eren's childhood home, a location his father had specifically told him to reach if the world ever fell apart, waited the full history the government had spent a century hiding. Humanity had not simply lost a war against Titans in the distant past and fled behind walls out of pure survival instinct. Humanity, or at least a nation of people called Eldians, had once possessed the power to turn into Titans and had used that power to build an empire and commit atrocities against other nations for a century. The people trapped behind the walls were not the last free humans on Earth. They were the descendants of the oppressors, hiding from the rest of a world that remembered exactly what Eldians had done and had spent generations building weapons and hatred aimed squarely at them. Outside the walls existed the nation of Marley, which had subjugated the remaining Eldian population left in the world after the Empire's collapse, forcing them to live in segregated internment zones, stripped of rights, treated as subhuman. While Marley harvested a small number of Eldian children each generation and turned them into weaponized Titan shifters called warriors, sent on missions against the very island where Eren lived. 2 of those warriors had already infiltrated Eren's own world. Reiner Braun and Berthold Hoover, cadets who had trained and bled alongside Eren for years, were revealed to be the armored Titan and the colossal Titan, the very creatures who broke Wall Maria and killed Eren's mother. They had not done it out of hatred. They had done it as children, following orders from a nation that told them the people on the other side of that wall were less than human. Devils in human skin who deserved what was coming. Reiner, in particular, spent years afterward barely able to hold together his own identity, fracturing under the weight of having become close friends with the very people his mission required him to eventually help exterminate, at one point genuinely believing, in a dissociative break, that he was still just a cadet, and none of it had happened at all. This is the point where the story stops being a monster story and becomes something far heavier. Every side had been taught that the other side deserved to die. The people inside the walls believed all Titans were mindless enemies. The people of Marley believed all Eldians on Paradise were devils. Both were fed lies engineered generations earlier by people who had died long before either side was born, and both generations were now killing each other over inherited hatred neither of them had chosen. The fallout from Reiner and Bertholdt's exposure led directly into one of the most devastating single moments in the entire story. Cornered at Shiganshina, Bertholdt transformed into the colossal Titan inside city walls, the resulting explosion of heat and force killing nearly the entire elite squad Levi had spent years training, people who had become Eren's found family inside the Corps. Levi, arriving too late to save them, was left standing among the bodies of soldiers he had personally chosen and trained, forced to keep moving forward anyway, because that was the only thing left that grief allowed him to do. Eren's response to learning all of this was not despair. It was a colder, more terrifying clarity. He began pursuing the very thing that had destroyed his childhood, the power hidden inside his own bloodline, the founding Titan. a power capable of controlling every Titan on Earth and rewriting the memories of every Eldian alive, currently sealed inside the body of Historia Rice's family line, the true royal bloodline the government had hidden for a century. What followed was an internal uprising against Eren's own government, exposing the corruption of the military police and the church that worshipped the walls as sacred, a conspiracy that went so deep it included Historia's own father, Rod Rice, who transformed into a titanic, mindless, nine-story titan of his own after a failed and horrifying attempt to inherit power he was never meant to hold, dying as a monster in front of the daughter he had spent her whole life neglecting. Historia's entire life up to that point had been defined by being unwanted. Born the illegitimate daughter of a nobleman who refused to acknowledge her, raised for years believing her name was Krista Lenz, she had spent her childhood learning to disappear, to be agreeable, to take up as little space as possible so no one would have a reason to discard her the way her own family already had. The one person who ever saw through that performance and loved the person underneath it was Ymir, another orphan with her own hidden Titan curse, who ultimately gave her life in a wolf Titan's jaws specifically to buy Historia time to escape, a sacrifice Historia carried like a debt she could only repay by finally becoming someone, rather than continuing to vanish for other people's comfort. Historia Rice ultimately claimed her birthright as queen and chose, deliberately, to break the chain of secrecy her family had maintained for generations, at the cost of her own comfort and safety, and in memory of the closest friend she had ever had. Armed with growing knowledge of the outside world, Eren and the Survey Corps eventually retook Wall Maria and Shiganshina itself in a battle that cost dozens of soldiers' lives, including a moment where Commander Erwin Smith, badly wounded, led what he believed was a final suicide charge and gave a speech asking his soldiers to give their hearts to the cause one last time, a decision Levi was forced to reverse at the very last second, choosing between saving his commander's life or using a rare healing serum on a half-dead Armin instead, a choice that still haunts every person who has ever watched it. Eren finally received the answer his father had left waiting in that basement, delivered directly into his memory through contact with the founding Titan. Eren learned the full truth of his father Grisha Yeager, a man who had once lived inside Marley as an Eldian, lost his first family to Marleyan brutality, escaped to Paradise, and personally carried both trauma and a stolen Titan power onto the island, planting the seeds for everything Eren would inherit, including memories, hatred, and a plan Grisha never lived to explain in person. Before any of that, the war had already introduced its strangest and, in some ways, cruelest weapon. During an expedition that went badly wrong, a Titan capable of speech, the Beast Titan, commanded an army of ordinary Titans from a distance and used a strange whispering ability to turn captured human beings, including soldiers Eren had trained beside, into mindless Titans themselves, a fate arguably worse than death, since the people they used to be technically still existed somewhere inside that new, ruined body, unable to do anything but wander and consume. Watching a friend turned into the very thing you had spent your life trying to kill, while some flicker of their humanity might still be trapped in there somewhere, added a horror to this war that no blade could ever fix. The being responsible for it, this Beast Titan, would later be revealed as Zeke, Eren's own brother, a connection that recontextualized every one of those horrifying transformations as something closer to family tragedy than random cruelty. Reiner did not simply disappear after Shiganshina. Broken by guilt and unable to live with what he had done, he eventually returned to the island alone, hoping the friends he had betrayed would simply kill him and end it. Instead, Eren, Mikasa, and the others took him prisoner, and in one of the story's quieter, stranger turns, sat across from the man who had destroyed their home and asked him, plainly, why. What he told them was not an excuse. It was a confession, one that made hating him both easier and impossible at the same time, because the boy in front of them had clearly been suffering as much as anyone he had ever hurt. That contradiction, a person capable of both atrocity and genuine remorse, sat at the center of nearly everyone this story asked its audience to judge. Not long after, Reiner and Bertholdt's home nation moved to reclaim its weapon. A joint Marleyan and warrior operation stormed Paradise's shore to recapture Eren by force. A raid that ended not in Marley's favor, but in a brutal underwater standoff, where Bertholdt was ultimately killed and Reiner, badly wounded and half out of his mind with despair, begged Eren to finish him rather than let him live with what remained of his life. Eren refused. Killing Reiner, he said, would be too easy an ending for both of them, a line that captured exactly how far the story had moved from simple revenge toward something far more complicated. From here, the story crosses the ocean. In Marley, a new generation of warrior candidates, children being raised the exact same way Reiner once was, told that killing devils on Paradise was an honor worth dying for, included a girl named Gabby Brown, Reiner's own young cousin, utterly convinced that Eldians on the island were monsters, and her friend Falco Grice, quietly uncertain whether any of what he had been taught was actually true. Watching them mirrored something the story had already shown once, children being fed hatred before they were old enough to question it, and it made unmistakably clear that Marley's side of this war was never the villain either. It was simply the other half of the same tragedy. That mirror became devastatingly literal during Eren's raid on Marley. In the chaos of the attack, Gabby, still fully convinced she was defending her home from monsters, shot and killed Sasha Blouse, one of Eren's oldest friends from training, a warm, food-obsessed soldier the group had teased for years and quietly loved. Sasha's death landed like a physical blow, not because it was dramatic, but because of how small and senseless it was. A girl acting exactly the way Eren himself once had, certain the person in front of her deserved to die, gunning down someone whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of an ocean. Her friends, especially Connie and Jean, who had spent years next to her, had to bury someone taken not by a Titan, but by the same inherited hatred that had shaped Eren's entire life, and for a long, quiet moment, the story asked its audience to sit with the fact that Gabby was not wrong to believe what she believed. She had simply never been given the chance to believe anything else. Eren, now aware of Marley's plans to eventually wipe out Paradise entirely using overwhelming military force, infiltrated Marley itself alongside a small team, revealing to the watching world in front of international dignitaries gathered to celebrate a military parade exactly what he was, and precisely what he could do. He slaughtered Marleyan leadership in a public display of violence deliberately staged to look like unprovoked monstrous aggression, a masquerade that hid a far more calculated goal underneath. Eren was manufacturing a reason for the entire world to unite against Paradise, accelerating a conflict he had already decided was inevitable, because he had seen, through the memory-sharing ability tied to his power, every possible future, and in almost all of them, Paradise was eventually annihilated by an alliance of nations terrified of Eldian power. Eren was not simply lashing out. He had concluded that the only way to guarantee his friends and his island survived was to become the villain the entire world already believed him to be, and to make sure that villain was strong enough that nothing on Earth could stop him. During this raid, Eren met his own half-brother for the first time, Scout Yeager, the Beast Titan, a man raised from birth by Grisha to be a weapon for Paradise, who had instead defected to Marley as a child after realizing his own father valued the mission more than him, and who now carried a very different plan, one where Eldians would simply stop reproducing entirely and let their bloodline and the suffering attached to it quietly end within a single generation. Eren rejected that plan outright. He did not want a peaceful extinction. He wanted his friends alive, on solid ground, free, no matter the cost to anyone standing between them and that outcome, even if that cost turned out to be nearly everyone else alive on Earth. That decision led to the single most devastating choice in the entire series. Eren activated the rumbling, unleashing the millions of Titans that had been buried inside Wall Maria, Rose, and Sina for a century, sending them marching across the Earth with a single directive: crush everything outside Paradise's shores. It was not metaphorical annihilation. It was the literal, physical erasure of the vast majority of human life outside the island, carried out by a boy who had once been a child screaming for someone to save his mother, now willing to become the very apocalypse the world had always feared Eldians represented, because he believed or convinced himself that it was the only path left that ended in his friends being safe. His former comrades, the people who loved him most, Mikasa, Armin, Levi, and the surviving warriors who had once been his enemies, including Reiner, Annie, Piek, and a Marleyan commander named Theo Magath, who had spent his career preparing children to die for his country and now had nothing left to offer but his own body in the fight to stop this, made the decision that had to be made. They formed an alliance against the person they cared about more than almost anyone, understanding that stopping him meant killing him, and that killing him meant severing every Titan power in the Eldian bloodline forever, since Ymir Fritz, the original source of every Titan power, had bound her own life force to the fate of the first king's descendants out of a devotion that outlasted death itself, and only Eren's death could finally free her, and every Titan on Earth, from that 2,000-year contract. The final battle took place inside the Titan mass Eren had become, a nightmare landscape of shifting flesh, where Armin, Levi, Mikasa, and the rest fought not just Eren's monstrous form, but the memory of who he used to be, while outside the fight, hang Zoe, the commander who had inherited Erwin's position and his belief that curiosity and hope were worth dying for, gave her own life, buying the Alliance enough time to reach him at all. Armin, once the weakest and most fearful of the group, talked to the boy underneath the monster, reminding him of a promise made as children, to see the ocean together, a promise that had, in its own quiet way, started this entire chain of events years earlier. And Mikasa, the girl who had spent her entire life organizing her existence around keeping Eren alive, made the one choice that could actually save him from what he had become. She killed him herself, ending both the rumbling and the man she loved in the same motion, carrying his severed head afterward not as a trophy, but as a farewell, kissing it once, before burying him with the scarf he had once wrapped around her neck as a child. The first act of kindness anyone had shown her after her parents' murder. A gesture that had quietly defined every choice she made for the rest of her life. In the final battle's chaos, one more quiet transformation occurred, easy to miss but enormous in what it meant. Falco Grice, the uncertain boy who had never wanted to believe Eldians on the island were monsters, ended up carrying Zeke's beast Titan power forward after Zeke's death, an inheritance he never asked for and did not want, taken on almost by accident while trying to save the people around him. It meant that even the ending of this war left behind another child, holding a power built entirely out of other people's decisions. Proof that even in the story's final hours, the cycle it had spent so long describing had not fully closed, only paused, in the hope that the next generation might choose differently with what little time this new peace bought them. The rumbling stopped before it destroyed all of humanity, though it did not stop before killing an overwhelming portion of the world's population, a horror that would define every surviving nation's relationship with Eldians for generations to come. Paradise survived, its remaining people forced to build a future in a world that had every reason left to hate them, guided now by leaders who had seen firsthand what unchecked vengeance, inherited hatred, and desperate love could turn a person into. Historia raised a child of her own, a new generation born without Titan power, since Ymir's curse had finally ended with Eren's death, meaning the era of shifting into monstrous forms, the entire mechanism that had defined this world for 2,000 years, was over. What came after Eren was not victory. It was simply survival, purchased at a price too enormous to ever fully account for, carried forward by people who chose, deliberately, to try to build something better out of the wreckage he left behind. Years later, Armin, now representing what remained of Paradise in a fragile diplomatic effort to keep the surviving nations from finishing what Eren started, returned quietly to the place where it had all ended, the tree beneath which they buried him. Jean came with him, and for a while neither of them said much because there was nothing left to argue about. They had spent years divided over whether Eren was a monster or a boy who ran out of choices, and standing there, they both understood the answer was simply that he had been both at different moments, sometimes in the same breath. Mikasa visited less often, not because she loved him less, but because grief, for her, had never been something she needed an audience for. She had spent her whole life keeping one person safe, and in the end, the only way she found to do it was to be the one who let him go. The lesson underneath all of this is not that monsters exist. It is that monsters are made, generation after generation, by people who never met each other, passing down hatred like an inheritance nobody asked to receive. Eren was a boy who wanted freedom more than anything else in the world, and in trying to seize it for the people he loved, he became the very cage he had spent his entire life trying to escape. The tragedy was never the Titans. It was always the walls people build inside each other's minds, walls made of inherited fear that no army and no power on earth can ever fully tear down. Every major character in this story believed at some point that they were doing the only thing left that could protect the people they loved. Grisha believed stealing a Titan power and fleeing to Paradise would save his family. Reiner believed following orders as a child would make him a hero back home. Zeke believed ending the Eldian bloodline quietly was mercy. Eren believed the rumbling was the only door left open. None of them were lying to themselves out of malice. They were doing what almost anyone raised inside enough fear and enough certainty might eventually convince themselves was necessary, and that, more than any Titan, is the part of this story that tends to stay with people long after the ending credits roll. If any part of this made you feel something, that tightness in your chest when a promise from childhood came back at the worst possible moment, that discomfort of realizing the villain had a point, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it, and subscribe. Because this channel exists for stories exactly like this one, the ones that sit with you long after they end. And leave a comment answering this. If you had been standing where Mikasa stood, holding the blade, loving the person on the other end of it, do you believe you could have made the same choice she did? Everything described here belongs to the original work, Attack on Titan, created by Hajime Isayama. This narration is a tribute to a story that deserves to be experienced in full. If anything you heard today moved you, surprised you, or made you curious, watch it. The original has scenes, music, and moments that no narration can fully capture. Find Attack on Titan on the streaming platforms available in your country and experience it for yourself.